Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So today we're going to continue the series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, more specifically in this video the Nintendo 64 Turbo Core from Robert or FPGA Zoom Spas. Because we've done a lot of different turbo tests across many disparate videos, I wanted to make a master video showing you all the different games you can play on the Turbo Core that are going to see medium to fundamental improvements with that overclock, because as good as the standard core is, the Turbo Core helps so many games become so much better. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But right off the top, one game where the Turbo Core brings it, in my opinion, to playable is Perfect Dark. On real hardware, this game just absolutely chugs on its own frame rate. It chokes on the performance, and I honestly don't find it to be playable on real hardware these days. Now I'm showing you two different versions here, the Turbo Core as well as the Turbo Core with a TLB patch, and you're going to see we're getting anywhere from the high teens to low 20s, almost up to 60 frames per second depending on what version we're using on the Turbo Core. On MiSTer FPGA, Perfect Dark, in my opinion, is an absolutely fun, absolutely playable experience no matter what version you use, the standard ROM or the TLB patched version. I would not say the same thing about real Nintendo 64 hardware or the stock core. I just think the performance of this game on real stock clock speeds is too slow to fundamentally be as fun as you want it to be. But that's the great thing about the Turbo Core, is it's fixing so many games that have just not aged very well. Getting, high 30s, low 40s in the frame rate on Perfect Dark on the stock version of the game in the Turbo Core just makes this that much more fun. And considering this game is aiming intensive, having those frames is going to let you perform better, and it's just going to let you have more fun. And that's what this is all about, showing you all the games that you should be playing on the Turbo Core side of things. But it's not just first-person shooters, absolutely not. There's so many other games you can play on the Turbo Core. Something like Banjo-Kazooie is just going to run fundamentally better on Turbo. Some of these examples I'll show you the frame rate, some I will just show you the screen cadence. Playing Banjo-Kazooie is still fun on the stock core or on real Nintendo 64 hardware, but you're basically getting a lock 30 frame per second experience out of something like Banjo-Kazooie on the Turbo Core, which is just giving you more fluidity. Obviously this game isn't as fast twitch as something like Perfect Dark, there's not a lot of aiming to be done, but your jumps and your platform are going to feel that much smoother at a higher frame rate, and overall playing Banjo-Kazooie, you gotta use the Turbo Core. Honestly, this is the best way to play it on MiSTer FPGA, and I prefer Banjo-Kazooie on the Turbo Core versus real Nintendo 64 hardware. Getting those extra 10 frames per second in a lot of spots makes such a difference, not in the overall look and feel of the game, but also in the control scheme. It just makes it feel smoother. You're not going to miss as many jumps, and that's something I always struggle with on these sort of games that have the lower frame rate. I will always miss my jump and basically press the button where I think it should go, but because of the frame rate I just don't get that same level of control performance. So definitely use the Turbo Core on Banjo-Kazooie. I'll show you Banjo-Tooie in a little bit, but honestly, getting the extra frames out of this game, 10 out of 10 exceptional. It just makes it feel like a more modern experience, and it's another perfect example of why the Nintendo 64 Turbo Core is so good over on the MiSTer FPGA side of things. But let's move back to another rare game, and this is obviously GoldenEye. This is another one which sees a nice uplift in the overall frame rate, whether you're using the stock game or any of the modified versions. This is definitely another one that can lose a lot of frame rate on real hardware, not down to the Perfect Dark levels of almost single digits, but it still can definitely slow down and chug in spots, and it's another game where playing on the Turbo Core just gives you such a better experience. The first-person shooter games I feel like benefit the most from the frame rate, because all of that aiming, the more frames per second you get, the more fluid the controls are, the better of a chance you're going to have at hitting your enemy the first time you shoot. And that's something on real hardware I've definitely struggled with when I've played these games in modern times. Back in the 90s, no one really noticed or cared, and we all got used to it, but as time has gone on, we've gotten used to games with higher frame rates on consoles and of course PC. It is very hard to go back to a game that runs super slow. Now granted, you're still going to be in the high teens to low 20s in a lot of areas here on the Turbo Core. It's not going to see as fundamental of an uptick as something like Perfect Dark, but honestly some of these areas could get to like 9 to 10 frames per second, so even getting an extra 5, 6, 7 frames is a massive uptick in the percentage of frames per second you're seeing on the core. And of course, marrying it to a game like GoldenEye, one of the best Nintendo 64 games of all time, If you haven't played this game in some years and you're testing stuff on MiSTer FPGA and playing Nintendo 64 games, definitely give GoldenEye a new playthrough on the Turbo core. You're going to find it to be a much more modern experience just by getting those extra frames out of the core, and who doesn't love extra frames? And the best part is, if you want the authentic Nintendo 64 experience, just load up the stock core and you're getting the frame rate you would expect out of real hardware. But something like Donkey Kong 64, and if you haven't noticed already, a lot of the rare games are the biggest beneficiaries of this Turbo core based upon having the unlocked frame rate. This is a game that seems to be able to stay at 30 frames per second almost the entire time you're playing it on the Turbo core, where on the stock core or on stock Nintendo 64 hardware, it definitely will dip down below 30. And that's how a lot of these things work. Some games have unlocked frame rate, so they will run as many frames per second as the hardware will allow power-wise. Other games like Donkey Kong 64 here seem to be capped at 30 frames per second. But just because something is capped at 30 frames per second doesn't mean it's always going to hit that. You'll see here we're down to 26. When we get back into the actual game, we're going to lift back up to 30. But what the Turbo core does is allow the game to persist at that 30 frame per second cap much more consistently than the standard clock speeds would. So if you have a game like Donkey Kong 64, which caps its frame rate at 30 frames per second, you're going to stay at that 30 frames per second so much more often on the Turbo core. And again, I think the two games that definitely benefit from the uptick in frame rate are first-person shooters and platform games. Completely different genres, but again, getting the extra frames and the extra speed in engine means you're getting a more responsive control scheme with the same fun. Obviously, Donkey Kong 64 is a divisive game. Some people love it, some people think it's a collectathon. I enjoy it, and I love getting more frames out of it. But another game that I would say has been made playable where I wouldn't consider it playable on real hardware is Turok 3. This section on the stock core or on real Nintendo 64 hardware is hovering at like 9 to 12 frames per second. Now we're getting into the high teens to the low to mid 20s, and that takes a game which is a slideshow that I do not like playing on real hardware and makes it something that you can sit down and enjoy. And honestly, this game always felt like something that was trying to be Half-Life and maybe pushing a little bit too hard at the overall Nintendo 64 hardware architecture. But I get asked the following question pretty much every video: does speeding up the game speed up the game audio? I can tell you on every single game it does not. Listen, I'll be right back with some more games.
Please don't hurt me.
So you heard there, all of the dialogue, all of the music in Turok 3 is playing as expected. I understand where this question comes from. Sometimes games would definitely affect their audio playback speed on an overclock, but on the Nintendo 64 core here, the way it is done, you're going to get the exact same audio in the exact same manner every single time you sit down and decide to play a game. So as far as that question is concerned, you're totally fine on the Turbo core. And something like Turok 3 here becomes just much more fun and much more playable with the extra frames, because personally, like I said just a bit ago, I do not think Turok 3 is an experience you want to have on the Nintendo 64 core at stock clock speeds or on real hardware, but on the Turbo core, this is definitely so much more playable. Now, probably my favorite uptick of any game on the Turbo core has got to be Castlevania Legacy of Darkness, because unlike the original Castlevania 64, this supported the expansion pack and allowed you to have a high resolution mode, which made the game look better, but unfortunately that high resolution mode also tanked the frame rate, turning it almost into a slideshow. Here on the Turbo core, you can play the high resolution mode, get a better looking image out of the core, and still get basically the exact same frame rate as if you were playing on real Nintendo 64 hardware with the high resolution mode turned off. And this is one where I'm not putting the frame rate up, I'm just letting you see the screen cadence, but the combat fluidity, the platforming, everything about Legacy of Darkness just made that much better on the Turbo core. And this is a game where falling off a platform, missing a jump or a grab is going to kill you and set you back a decent amount of time. And you'll see here when we go to clean HDMI mode as well, we can get that interlacing off, we can can get the turbo speeds up, we can have a better experience with this game, and we have more responsive controls, which are going to keep those falling deaths down to a minimum, just making the game that much more fun to play. So this is personally my favorite improvement on the turbo core. But leave me a comment down below if you're playing the turbo core, which game have you enjoyed seeing the most with more frames per second. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of different answers, but for me, 100% it's Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. And I'm not saying this is a perfect game whatsoever, but it is much better than you've heard. And if you've never played it before, just grab your MiSTer FPGA, grab your controller, launch the turbo core, and play it there. It is going to be the best Legacy of Darkness experience you can have across any platform, and in my opinion, including software emulation as well. Now, games that see an uptick and do perform better on the turbo core but aren't perfect, something like the Super Mario 64 decompilation project here, which should be running the game at 60 frames per second, can hit that 60 frames per second on MiSTer FPGA on the turbo core, which is something that the stock core and real hardware cannot do. Unfortunately, it can't do it every single frame, so you are going to see situations in which this game slows down when it can't hit that 60 frame per second cap. But Mario jumping out of the pipe there, you've never seen that many frames and that much fluidity before. What this does though is if you're dropping frames, it slows down the in-game speed. Some games just drop frames and they get choppier in the visual presentation. Other games, when they drop frames, will actually slow down the in-game speed so that it almost feels like you're playing it in slow motion or underwater. So as we jump into the next area here, you're going to see that happen in real time where the game slows down, but this is still a lot of fun to check out just as a curiosity, and I knew if I didn't put this in a video, people were going to ask about it. So this is one of those things. You're going to get a better experience on the turbo core than on real stock speeds, but you're still not going to have a perfect experience. This is something that definitely feels like it's an emulation only sort of project, but it also feels fun to test, and I knew everyone would say, hey, what about Super Mario 64 60 frames per second? So if you want to play it, give it a shot. It's not perfect, but it is still definitely fun and worth checking out. Now on to games that don't see any improvement on their frame rate but are working better on the turbo core. I have played Resident Evil 2 start to finish on turbo with absolutely no freezing whatsoever. I've also had 3 other people report the exact same thing, and I can say now that one person's also completed a clear playthrough with no freezing whatsoever. If you play this on the stock core, there is a random chance that you will see freezing in the game, maybe 2, 3, 4 freezes per playthrough. On the turbo core, if you get this thing to freeze, you better go buy a lottery ticket because your luck is that bad, but that exponentially rare. So this is another one of those titles where the turbo core makes vast improvements, but it's not in the performance of the frame rate. It is 100% down to the performance of the stability of the game. And I didn't mention Conquer in here, even though I am working on that, because that's one of those things I'm still not 100% sure what's going on with improving Conquer on the turbo core and the prototype ROM. But if you want to play Resident Evil 2 on MiSTer FPGA today, play the turbo core. It basically means the game won't freeze, or will freeze maybe once in an entire playthrough. Now another game that's fundamentally improved is Banjo-Tooie, not just on the stock version of the game, but on the 60 frame per second patch as well. This is going to let you get up to 60 frames per second, and while it's not going to do that every single time in every single instance, you're going to get such a smooth, fluid version of this game. It's almost going to feel like a remaster that did nothing but improve the in-engine performance and kept all the artwork stock. And you'll see here as I kind of look around with the camera, you get those reflections on the floor, but we're still basically persisting at 60 frames per second. There's so many fun visual effects in something like Banjo-Tooie. Some of the cutscenes are definitely going to push it down to the 30s, but you're going to see here again, it's going to jump back up to 60 frames per second the minute we get back in, and it kind of likes to dance around between like 35 to 60 frames. But this is another game. If you're going to play Banjo-Tooie on the MiSTer FPGA cores, do it on the turbo core, do it on the 60 frame per second patch version, and you're going to get such a fluid experience. It's going to feel like playing the game for the first time all over again. Now you'll see here in the cutscene, you're going to get to 60 frames per second. It'll dip down to 24 depending on what's going on screen at once, but it's just going to be a better version of the game again. And the cutscenes are where this game would definitely chug on real hardware back in the day. So in gameplay, you're getting closer to 60, and the cutscenes where it doesn't really matter, you're still seeing more frames and you're getting a more fluid experience. Now, I showed you guys in a separate video, Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time both have 30 frame per second patches that you need to enable in the menu, and you can play them on real hardware. But on the turbo core, you're going to get to that 30 frame per second cap basically almost the entire time you're playing it, versus real hardware or the stock speed core where you can hit 30 frames per second. It's just not going to be for as long, and it's going to be a lot harder to find that 30 frame per second mark. You're going to get closer to like 24 or 25. And honestly, who wouldn't want a more fluid Majora's Mask or Ocarina of Time on the turbo core? These games just feel more fluid, they look better, they feel better, the combat is better as well. Now, this does have auto jumping, and I believe Nintendo programmed that in there specifically just to make sure that you didn't miss jumps at a low frame rate. But you'll see here, we just turned on 30 frame per second mode, and you can toggle it on or off. We're going to run up here. This is at the 20 frame per second mark, and look at the screen cadence, look at the speed of Link as he goes through this one area of the village. What we can do is then turn 30 frames per second back on as we make a second run at it, and you're going to see the difference without a counter on screen of just how much different the fluidity is. Now we're at 30 frames per second going through the same area, and you can absolutely with your naked eye tell just how much of an uptick we are seeing by running that game at 30 frames per second. And you have the turbo core on the left, stock core on the right, and you're going to see in Hyrule Field here in Ocarina of Time, everything is just that much smoother. You can only do this on the turbo core. Yes, you can run the 30 frame per second patch version on the stock core, but you're not going to actually hit that 30 frames per second near as much. Same patch, same area, two different cores, two different experiences entirely. And trust me, Majora's Mask at 30 frames per second and Ocarina of Time at 30 frames per second are incredible. And if you find any areas of the game where you think 20 frames per second works better, or if there's any glitches, you can just pop back right into the menu, go back to the 20 frame per second mode, which would be the original for both games, go through whatever area you want, and then pop back into the menu, go back to 30 frames per second, and continue with your playthrough. I do believe there's one area in one of the dungeons in Ocarina of Time that has a little bit of a glitch at 30 frames per second, so when you encounter that, just slow it down. Other games like Vigilante 8 here, they're going to run on the turbo core that much better, and because this does have a code for max resolution mode, maybe not my favorite game on the Nintendo 64, but one you're going to see a huge uptick in frame rate on. And do be aware, this video is not every single game where you're going to get some extra frames, it's just some of my favorite experiences on the turbo core. Something like Diddy Kong Racing side by side here, you're just going to see on the left of the turbo core how many more frames per second you have. This game fundamentally, just play it on the turbo core, ignore the stock core in its entirety, because you just want more frames per second in a racing game as well. And in the side by side here, locked frame to frame, you just get a persistent 60 frames per second, and when you get in game, the fluidity you see on screen here is just absolutely spectacular. This is so much better at near 60 frames per second. It performs so much better on the turbo core, and it is the one game featuring Conquer on Nintendo 64 cores that's 100% rock solid stable. So if you want to play Diddy Kong Racing, you should just be doing it on the turbo core unless you want the authentic Nintendo 64 experience, which would mean lower frame rates. And even fan games, something like Mario Kart Amped here, this is definitely something designed for both real hardware as well as emulation, and it has some modes on the graphical effects side of things that are going to chug on the stock Nintendo 64 core or real hardware, but pop them into the turbo core and suddenly you have an improved experience. You get widescreen and a better frame rate. Now, when I talk about games that become playable that I don't think would be playable, something like Mega Man 64 definitely comes to mind. This game's frame rate was never good on Nintendo 64, even though visually I like how the presentation looks on Nintendo 64 better than I do PlayStation 1, but on the turbo core, suddenly you're basically getting as close to a locked 30 frame per second as you possibly can, and that is always a good thing, because this game is relatively combat heavy. There's a lot of different effects that would slow down real hardware, but you'll see here as we run around, everything is just at 30 frames per second, making this, in my opinion, a really fun way to play the game. And I do think with the Nintendo 64 hardware, this game is slightly prettier here than it is on PlayStation 1, but leave me a comment down below and you tell me. As we pop back to the standard core, again, you're going to see we get close close to 30 frames per second, but we just dipped down there to 15 and the game absolutely chugged and became less controllable and less fun because of that. So this is another game where if you put turbo core mode on, you're just going to get basically a locked 30 frames per second the entire time outside of a few small blips, versus something like the stock core, which is just going to absolutely tank your frame rate. And of course, Pilot Wings, again an unlocked frame rate game. Because of the way you control this, especially the jetpack being so sensitive, it is another title where getting more frames per second just means better controls. But these are my recommended games for you to play on the Turbo Core today. There's so many more that are going to see upticks in the frame rate, but these are my favorites. These are the ones that I think in one way or another improve and benefit from having a higher frame rate, whether it's in the control or the overall visuals. But leave me a comment down below and tell me what your favorite game to play in the Turbo Core is, and I would be curious to hear that. But we are done. Go play some Nintendo. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.